Okay, let's get started. Good afternoon and welcome to session 2 of the Linking Administrative Data with Survey Data Virtual Data Training. I'm your host, Amber Amin-Ra, and the Project Data Manager here at ICPSR on the campus of the University of Michigan. Please remember to mute yourselves during the training. Instructors will announce when to take yourselves off mute. If you have any questions or technical difficulties, please feel free to use the BlueJeans chat feature or you can email me or Bianca. Have a few announcements. Instructors will be posting notes to assist with the exercises at the end of each session. We will be using groups and conferences for small group exercises. The directions are posted in the announcements. I put them in the BlueJeans chat, and right before the exercise, I'll also walk you through the process. I would like to introduce Zachary Seeskin, who will walk you through understanding administrative data, data use agreements, and informed consent.
Great, thanks so much, Amber. I'll just go ahead and set up the slide. Okay, so first thing is, can everybody see the slides okay and see and hear me okay? Okay, excellent. Okay, so I'm really excited about this topic and think this is a really neat subject for this course. I think that the way I think we hear somebody's background noise. If you could mute your microphone, please. I think that the way both research, new innovations in research, and also in official and government statistics are looking more and more to using data sources that go beyond surveys, recognizing the potential and the value of administrative and related data sources for research, and recognizing the challenges that are facing using survey data alone, where with increasing costs for surveys and declining response rates over time present some challenges. So today we're going to discuss administrative data quality. So before you conduct your data linkage and you're interested and you've identified the administrative data set you want to work with and you want to understand its data quality to inform your analysis plan, how would you do that? What are the particular issues facing administrative data? And then go into some aspects of managing data linkage project, including data use agreements and informed consent. So the plan for today, I want to start off by making sure that everyone's caught up and see if there's any questions based upon yesterday's lecture or the project proposals so far. As I mentioned, today's main focus will be on administrative data, whereas future lectures are going to talk about the questions concerning using the linked data. Today we're going to particularly focus on the administrative data set or commercial data set or other data set for policy research. Sometimes you have a chance to analyze and learn about the administrative data set before conducting your research. And so how would you go about doing that? So by the end of today, you'll have a definition of data quality and what that means in the context of policy research. You'll understand what particular issues face administrative data and how they are different from analyzing survey data, and understanding data quality, which is a multidimensional concept. What are the different aspects of it that are important? How would you assess data quality, and what are the limitations? At the end of the lecture, we'll focus on, again, the legal requirements, the ethical responsibility to protect the privacy of individuals or entities represented in the data. So we'll discuss specifically data use agreements and informed consent for participants who are having their data linked to the survey data set. And we'll wrap up by talking about what's coming next in the course and the project proposal work as it relates to this lecture. Okay. So just wanted to start off, see if there are any questions about the course so far or material from the first lecture, and also about your project proposal. So you can either unmute yourself to ask a question or enter your question in the chat box. I'll give folks a bit of time. Okay, so it looks like perhaps no questions at this time, but we'll keep an eye on the chat box in case any questions come in the next couple minutes. Okay, so a recap of Rupa's first lecture. We defined the kinds of administrative data set that are in scope for this course using a fairly broad definition of what administrative data are. This includes the data that are traditionally described as administrative. That would be data from federal, state, or local agencies, typically administering a government program, but we're also including data that comes from private sector companies that can be acquired for policy research. So sometimes refer to this as commercial data. We learned about the NSECE and its importance for policy research and for planning, the valuable data that it provides on families' child care needs and the availability of child care providers. And then Rupa reviewed prominent examples of data linkages to the NSECE. I think she did a good job of representing the range of the kinds of data sets that can be linked and the value that data linkage can provide. So one example was child care subsidy records that provide information about low-income families that can enrich and add to what's in the survey data, and data that can also be used to validate the survey measures. A very different kind of example was real estate finance data from Zillow, for example. So it's an example of private sector data. You could even think about a version of this where we could be scraping data from the web. Zillow has an API, for example, but in this case, I think the data was able to be acquired directly from Zillow. So you can study how home values are related to the use and provision of childcare in different areas. And we provided many other kinds of examples representing the rich possibilities when conducting data linkage. And so a definition of data quality. I provide a simple and quite commonly used definition of data quality as the fitness of a data set to serve its intended use. So for this course, we're focused on policy research. We're specifically interested in how to use data to draw statistical inferences to inform policy decisions. There's other uses of data, of course. Administrative data are commonly used for the administration of a program, for planning, and just depending upon the kind of use, data quality could have a very different meaning in what you need for that use. Data are commonly used for decision-making in different contexts, but decision-making in a business context might be different from policy research, where for policy, we're interested in ethical concerns, people being treated fairly. There's additional considerations, maintaining the public trust. And we're also combining administrative data with survey data, and we're thinking about using the linkages to use the data sources in different ways, to use different strengths from the data sources. So the requirements of data quality may be different for even different kinds of linkages. So we'll discuss some examples later in an exercise where there's a difference in what you might require from data quality if the data that are coming from your administrative data source you plan to use as dependent variables in your analysis or the object of the analysis, versus if you're using them as covariates in a statistical model to adjust a model that may be based primarily on your survey data. Two very valuable uses of administrative data, but you have different quality considerations in those situations. Okay. So for administrative data, we need data quality support drawing statistical inferences to inform policy conclusions. We have to think about what aspects of the statistical inferences are important to guide policy. A classic textbook from Shadish, Cook, and Campbell had a really nice discussion of aspects of statistical inference, and they described four major aspects of validity of an inference. Many these are important for administrative data. The first would be statistical conclusion validity. This would be conclusions about the relationships among variables. This would really refer more to correlations between variables rather than causation. Having appropriate statistical power and good measurement would both be aspects of statistical conclusion validity. Internal validity goes a step further, and that's assessing cause and effect. So if you implement a policy, what would the effects and the outcomes be? The gold standard for having inferences with internal validity is to conduct randomized controlled trials, but we can also conduct causal analysis using observational data sets. It's just a little bit more challenging to draw those kinds of inferences. Construct validity would refer to whether a measurement measures a concept that's intended to be studied. So a classic kind of example is if you want to study intelligence and you're measuring test scores. Do the test scores capture the intelligence you want to measure well enough, or is that too indirect of a measure? And we could think about an example that's maybe pertains to administrative data or a little bit simpler. So let's say you are interested in measuring somebody's income, but you're only able to capture information about their salary. Let's say you have data from some employers and have people's salaries, but not their entire income. So that salary is very valuable to have, but maybe doesn't fully capture the concept of the income that would be a better measure to have. So yeah, different kinds of examples of the challenges of construct validity in using administrative data sources. External validity would refer to you draw an inference from your data set. It pertains to the data that you analyze, but is that inference generalizable to the broader population that you're interested in? This is where surveys have particular strength, where we can conduct random sampling that allows the data to be representative and allow externally valid inferences for the population of interest. So I would say for surveys, we're usually most interested in statistical conclusion validity, construct validity, and particularly external validity. Often internal validity is left to randomized controlled trials, but people also analyze survey data sets to draw causal inferences, of course. And so in different situations, administrative data sets could have different strengths and weaknesses for these aspects of statistical validity. Okay, so next I want to break into our groups for our first of two exercises. So based upon what you know about administrative data or what you think some of the issues might be, I want you to brainstorm 3 examples of what aspects of an administrative data source would make that source either higher or lower quality for conducting policy research. And I think Amber can provide further instruction on breaking into the small group.
Okay, so don't leave the Blue Jeans session, but keep it muted. In Canvas, you'll see a groups icon on the left side of the navigation bar. Click on groups. Once you're there, go down and click on conference, and you'll see session 2's conference has already started. You can click join. Once you're inside, just use the chat feature on the right-hand side.
Excellent. Thanks, Amber. So I think we'll give around 8 minutes for teams to discuss and brainstorm, and then we'll regroup, and I'll ask for a representative from each team to report back and share ideas. I'll aim to give about a 5-minute warning and a 2-minute warning. Yeah, thanks. about 5 more minutes for each team. And it looks like the teams were all able to connect smoothly, but if anybody had an issue, let us know on the chat box. Thanks. And last couple minutes for each team. All right, so let's regroup. I'll stop sharing the slide for a second for discussion. So I think there are two groups, so if I could have a volunteer from each group, give a couple examples of what aspects of data quality you would want to assess for an administrative data source.
This is Madeline. I'll start for group 2. We talked about the timeliness of the data. So can you get it from the administrative source in a timeline that makes sense for a policy relevant issue? Data quality and cleanliness, the availability of a good linking variable to the data set that you have. Scale or unit issues. So is it being collected at the right geography or household level or whatever it is that you're trying to deal with? And then sort of interpretation of what they have in their data. So the metadata documentation and how good that is and whether they've explained what exactly the data that you're looking at means.
That's great. That's a very thorough list. Good examples of where we're going. So as we'll discuss, the challenge of administrative data is that you get what you get, that you don't have a statistical office or agency who's making sure that the data have all the properties and the cleanliness and are working in a certain time frame to make sure that the data are available, that the data have all the aspects of quality that you would want to have necessarily. So these are all things that often can be overcome, but things you'd want to check. Those are all great examples. Group number 1, a couple examples of which came when you're brainstorming, either similar or different from group 2. A volunteer from group number 1.
Okay, so I think our group talked primarily the same as what group 2 just covered in terms of the inconsistencies among the constructs and data cleanliness. And also sometimes I feel like in my own experience, the data collected by DOE, they're just very basic and only cover certain demographics because it's not specifically designed for statistical analysis. So a lot of the variables probably are missing from what the researchers have in mind.
Yeah, I think those are all great examples as well. One thing that we'll discuss and that I've seen is that often what you see with an administrative data set is that there's certain variables that are really critical to the administration that are higher quality or well populated, limited missing data, but then other variables that you're interested in for policy research may not be as have more missing data or may have quality concerns just because that they're not as important for administration. Okay, great. Thank you both. We'll go back to the PowerPoint slide. All right, so hopefully everybody can see that again. Okay, so I'm going to jump into a lot of the themes that the team brainstorm and go into a bit more detail as well. So the key thing about administrative data, as we discussed, is that the researcher, the statistical agency, doesn't control the data collection. In some instances, I think would be pretty rare. There might be some feedback that can occur between a statistical agency and the agency administering the program, but I think that's the exception to the rule. Bob Gross, as some of you may know, was the director of the Census Bureau a while back, has drawn a neat distinction, some recent writing, a helpful distinction between found data and designed data. We can think about surveys as designed to have the properties that are needed to support inference. There still are many challenges to get the data have those properties, but whereas administrative data would be found data. They just come as they are, and they're valuable, but just because of their nature as found data, there are some limitations. The data were collected for the purpose of the administration of the program. We discussed that Certain variables are important for the administrative need, others may not be. Another particular thing about administrative data is that they are can be affected by legislation or could need to respond to legislative requirements. So an example would be tax data. IRS data is being very commonly used in policy research and been found to have some good properties relative to survey reports. It's pretty challenging for somebody to look up for a survey details about their financial background that can be just taken directly from tax records. But as this, at the beginning of this calendar year, we had a new tax law passed, which will mean a change in the Form 1040 that's used to collect a lot of that data. So that means that there are challenges to understand that transition, what's coming in with the data, and work needs to be done that can possibly be overcome to understand, to adjust to those changes in the form, but without really careful consideration, you could have a break in series that could make 2016 and 2017 data, IRS tax data, not so comparable with 2018 or 2019. For commercial data, they're curated for the purpose of a business need. They're often packaged and sold to other companies where a statistical agency or researchers are not the main target for the product, even though the researchers recognize the value of the data. So there are certainly risks there of the data not being collected for statistical uses. Two aspects that are related, there are challenges with administrative would be the documentation and the data cleanliness, which we've talked about a bit. Surveys have very strong documentation to support data users. You can get details on all the aspects and steps that from the data collection to the final data set. Administrative data set, your documentation will tend to be much more limited, and often the process for how the final data set was created and curated can be a little bit mysterious. Administrative data and commercial data may have a smaller set of initial users who are managing the program. There's some internal knowledge about how to use and understand those data sets, which would mean that there's less work into the documentation. Even seen examples where there can be a detective work needed to find out what variables represent. You might have a limited code book, but that code book really doesn't have the full detail to understand what exactly those variables mean and what they're aiming to measure. For similar reasons, the data may not be very clean. I've seen examples where there are variables that get swapped in the data. So for a certain time period, you have two variables switch with each other, and you would need to have some clever investigation to discover that when you see this puzzling change in trend. That kind of thing can happen. It certainly can be hard to compare data that's aggregated from multiple agencies, state agencies, and local agencies. So how are you going to structure the data to make sure that the data formats are similar when you bring data from multiple agencies together? And again, if there's only a few initial users at the agencies who are relying on certain variables being higher quality, but not paying attention to the whole data set's ability to support policy research, you can't always count on the data to be as organized as for survey data. This table represents a pretty thorough list of data quality elements that could either apply to survey or administrative data. They've been informed by literature reviews and experiences on different projects. Some of this comes from literature from statistical agencies, particularly in Europe, where statistical agencies are using administrative data pretty broadly, sometimes in place of censuses and surveys. They've done a lot of good work in documenting what are different data quality aspects and how would you go about assessing these in administrative data. So we've grouped them into related concepts in this table, 5 different groups. Accuracy has many different aspects and certainly requires careful assessment. It would refer to both kind of the data input and can you trust that you have the correct values in the data, and then the data output to support producing estimates and statistical inferences that are approximately correct. So the different aspects would be measurement error, whether the values that are in the data source are the true values, whether they are correct. In different situations, we can imagine that can either be a strength of administrative data or surveys, so we'll revisit that point. There's a lot of steps for processing to arrive at the final data set, and any of those could have decisions that introduce error or mistakes in the processing. So processing error is an element, and that could potentially affect both surveys and administrative records. Construct validity would reflect that the topic measured is the one that is intended to be measured for the research. So for surveys, we might only get indirect measures to reduce respondent burden. So we're revisiting the example of measures of financial background. You might ask a simpler question that in order to reduce the respondent burden and get an approximate concept of what you'd like to obtain. So that could be a challenge there. In administrative data, you don't get to, whereas in survey data, there's a lot of thought in how you phrase a question, what you collect. In administrative data, it's more that you get what you get. And then an aspect we'll also revisit later is external validity. Are your data representative of the population? You want to avoid certain kind of cases being missed by your data, or having cases that are out of scope included to avoid over or under representation. Relevance is an important component. You have a policy topic that you're interested in and making sure that your data supports studying that specific topic. There are factors related to timeliness and time-related factors. This came up in our discussion. You want to have the data available in time to inform policy decisions. And a couple other ways that time can play in. So surveys typically rely on a reference date that can allow for comparability. So for the census, you respond based upon your situation as of April 1st of the census year, or for for a survey, you might answer about your employment situation as of a certain date. Administrative data may be collected from different time periods, and that can make it difficult to reconcile and analyze your data. We've grouped accessibility, clarity, and transparency together. Accessibility would refer to the conditions in which the data can be obtained and analyzed, where, how, and the general availability of that data to users. Clarity would refer to that the data or the statistical information or resulting estimates are available in a clear and understandable format. The documentation is a critical part of this. And transparency refers to the methodologies for producing the data, arriving at the final data set or the final estimates are clear, and that understanding that to know how to interpret your data or your ultimate estimate. And again, you usually get a lot of detail for surveys, but sometimes you're limited when you're using administrative or commercial data. The final group is coherence and comparability. Coherence would refer to the ability to combine your data or statistics with other statistical information that's available. That can refer to record linkage, linking keys, but it can also refer to combinations of data sources and estimates beyond record linkage. So do you have the appropriate information and context for the estimate to bring together data or estimates from different kinds of sources? And comparability would refer to if your data collection practices and measures have the same processes as across groups you want to compare, across geographies, or over time, that allow you to make good conclusions about comparisons between different groups. Some recent frameworks have found it really helpful to think about sources of error for administrative data in terms of the rows or the entities, households, persons reflected in the data set, and the variables and the columns. So thinking about the data set in terms of rows or columns. Now, not all data is structured in such a way, but often we can think about the data set as in this flat format of rows and columns can help us to think about the issues. So, some context is there's a lot of literature, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, for total survey error frameworks that break down sources of error in surveys into different components. One would be sampling errors, so that would be related to having a subset of the population that would typically be quantified by a standard error on your estimate or a confidence interval. And then there are non-sampling errors, which would come from missing data, coverage errors, measurement errors that contribute to error for the ultimate estimate. So more recent work has adapted this to think about what the issues are for administrative data, which are in a somewhat different context. Some of this is based upon a discussion from a new textbook, Big Data and Social Science. Statistician Paul Beamer has a nice framework he lays out for either administrative data or other sources he calls big data sources. So I'll start with rows, and you have a population of records, and where the rows represent families, households, NSECE with child care providers, individuals. There are some records that are omitted that should be in, so under coverage or omission. There are some records that might be included twice, those would be duplications, and some records that are included wrongly. Again, this that would contribute, those would be erroneous conclusions leading to overcoverage. And administrative data are different to think about than survey data. In survey data, we sample and then we think about the design and weighting to have generalizable inferences. And administrative data, typically you, for thinking about administering a program, for example, you think about having all the records for cases receiving a benefit or benefiting from a program in your data. For columns and variables, we have validity error, which would the terminology used for construct validity. Do you measure what you intend to measure? Then there's measurement error or inaccurate values, and then there may be mistakes in data processing, and finally, missing data. Now you can think about these in some examples that could affect a whole variable, so a validity error, the way the concept is measured is incorrect for the whole variable, or it could affect just specific values within a variable. I want to dive a little bit deeper into the critical dimension of accuracy and discuss some of the specific issues for administrative data. Again, we might think about administrative data as strong in terms of coverage. So for the administration of a program, so we want to think about the examples of SNAP food stamps or TANF, temporary assistance for needy families. In theory, you should have a record for all cases receiving benefits. So in a sense, you wouldn't expect to have missing cases in your data. But there are instances where you might be interested in a certain group for policy, where that group may be systematically missing from the data set. The group may just not be needed for administration of the program, even though you're interested in for policy. So you need either a strategy to handle that or a recognition of a limitation of that element of the data source. Now, when you have missing records in households and families and administrative data, there's an issue of what exactly does that mean? The fact of missingness may be important, for example, indicating not receiving benefits. Or it could be a different issue and a data error, and sometimes you see a record missing that you expect to be there from linkage to the survey, it can be hard to figure out which is the case, if it's a data error or reflecting a change in receiving benefits. Examining TANF records, again, temporary assistance for needy families, it can be hard to separate a case if you see a case have an interruption in receiving benefits. It can be hard to tell if that case no longer was eligible for benefits for a certain period, or there is a program churn and some administration issue, or that case just missed benefits for a period of time, and that will have implications for the ultimate policy analysis you want to do. So design data take great care to manage, but they can be subject to coverage errors, but typically there's great done statistically thinking about methods to address those coverage issues. So that's a contrast from administrative data where, again, you get what you get. So when these kinds of issues arise, should be concerned about systematic bias in the inferences you draw from such a data set and the external validity of the data set. Measurement error and could be either a strength or a weakness of administrative data source. So surveys are subject to recall bias, cognitive issues for the respondent, respondent burden, that people have limited time, and that can lead to completing a survey in a rushed way and lead to errors. So that may be an advantage for administrative data in some cases. Administrative data also come from a ground truth measure. It comes from one single data source and doesn't depend upon several respondents to look up the information or determine it on their own. But again, issue for administrative data is that the data are not collected for statistical purposes, that the information may not be clean, so you need to do checks to see if you can trust the numbers. And again, the number that's needed for administration may be different from the number that you're actually interested in for policy research. So now we have a good understanding of what different elements and aspects of data quality are that you want to assess. So what are some ways that you can go about assessing them? The researchers, I think the European statistical agencies are certainly leaders and have suggested different measures to help assess data quality. Generally, I think often these are indirect, and many of these measures have some weaknesses. Your very best situation is to have some kind of gold standard data set that you trust, that you can compare to for assessment, but often that gold standard data set doesn't exist or is hard to obtain. You can, when you have that gold standard, you can either see if you can link at the record level to verify, or you can look, compare resulting estimates to estimates that you trust. But often there is some amount of guesswork in assessing different dimensions of data quality. So here's a table that presents different measures that reflect the accuracy dimension alone. One would be item non-response. So for a specific variable, what's the extent of missing data? That could lead to biases for any inferences for which you use that variable, if that missingness is related to key variables that you're interested in. Under coverage, so can you measure an extent to units that should be included in the data set but aren't? That could be a limitation of the data set. So if you link to a survey and you think some records should be in the data set that aren't, that could provide you a measure of under coverage. And over coverage would be if you can detect duplicates or detect records that are out of scope and quantify that. Or if you are able to, can you successfully identify them and remove them, but you're not always able to do that. We discussed time factors that are related to accuracy. So you may have some indication that the reference period for some cases differs from other records. Often you do get information on the time period from which data come. And finally, you would expect variables to have to fall within certain ranges, particularly of a code book, or you'd expect certain logical relationships among the variables. So checking rates of fails for these relationships would be a good indicator that you can trust the data. And an extension of this would be to use methods for outlier detection. Even though something is of value is not illogical, it seems unexpected, and you might check for the prevalence of those kinds of outliers to make sure that you can trust the administrative data source. So this is a table that has a more comprehensive list of indicators for the different dimensions. Typically, these are pretty simple ideas that can be assessed without doing a substantial analysis. So many of these are very helpful and quite possible to do. This shows many aspects of data relevance that you can quantify. So you can assess. So you want to look at the definitions of units and variables to make sure that those are the ones that are most relevant for the analysis that you want to do. What is the reference time period? Do you have the domains and the groups of interest for policy research? And what's the thoroughness and scope and the richness of the data to do the analysis that you want to do? Accuracy has been pretty well covered, so a lot of similar themes to what we've discussed before, so I'll skip over that. Timeliness and measures could encompass how frequently the data are updated, so that for policy, if you want to track changes over time, that the data are updated frequently enough. We discussed the time for the data delivery. Administrative data sometimes take time for an agency to process and deliver. So you want to consider that you can get the data source in time to inform policy decisions. And a different aspect of that is the uncertainty of when the data arrive. You need to have some certain, there can be variability in when the data are available. And it's good to have indication that you know the data will arrive in time. You can assess comparability over time. So in some work we've done here at NORC looking at data quality, we found that very simple time series graphs can reveal unexpected data patterns suggesting data inconsistency. You see I have a jump in the time series for a certain variable that suggests an issue that you want to address. You can take a parallel idea and apply it to cross-geography or cross-group comparisons. If you expect some differences, of course, but if you see something that's unexpectedly large, that could suggest an issue. This does not provide specific indicators for availability and clarity here, but certainly can reach out to the data provider for the documentation that's available and see if that documentation is rich enough to provide you what you need, how the data are presented, and making sure that you have a good way to access the data. There's not as much literature on the use of data visualization for assessing quality of administrative data, but here at NORC, we found that data visualization can be incredibly helpful. Multivariate data visualization may be a little bit complex at first, but it can allow for gathering many different kinds of variables and assessing the patterns in aggregate to suggest where there may be concerns. So this is something that I would suggest considering. Some simple things can be done, so looking at distributional plots for your variable densities for the distributions. This shows an example of a powerful plot we found on the table plot. The idea here is to pick a sorting variable. So in this example, it's age. It could be time or any other key variable in your data set. And then the other columns reflect other variables, and they are sorted by that first sorting variable. The y-axis, if you will, is percentiles of the age distribution. So this example shows different categorical variables. So by these different groupings of age, it gives you the distribution patterns. And from this example, you can see gender in the third column, marital status in the fourth column. You can see changes in those variables over age in the data set, which is a sensible result that you would expect. So this this example I provide is more exploratory, less related to data quality. What we found is you can find strange changes in the distributions by using this kind of plot that can suggest an issue that requires further investigation. And these are all categorical variables in this plot, but you can look at continuous variables as well. So if anybody wants to try this, I think the R package is called table plot, and can track continuous variables and looking at the spread of the distribution and changes in the mean or the center of that distribution. Okay. Now to set up our second exercise today, writing an example from some data quality analyses from my own research. So as a Census Bureau dissertation fellow, I did work to look at commercial property tax data that was available from CoreLogic. The Census Bureau was interested in investigating whether administrative data sources could be used in conjunction, linked to the American Community Survey, to provide information for housing statistics, even if the information from other data sources was high quality enough to remove a question from the questionnaire. So I did analyses on linked CoreLogic and ACS data, largely focusing on single-family homes. So I assessed the coverage of the data set by linking to the 2010 ACS and finding the percent that were matched. And what we found is first looking at state coverage, there were three states that were entirely missing from the data set, several others that were pretty low, while there were other states that were pretty good, 70% or 80% or higher. And we used the same data and did a similar analysis, but by some key characteristics in the data set. We found some major differences in the coverage of the CoreLogic data. So particularly what stood out was that rural households were underrepresented. The data were just not as often available in rural areas compared to urban areas. There are differences by socioeconomic status as well, but not as stark. And we think that this was probably reflecting other key patterns in the data. So the exercise based upon looking at this kind of data quality analysis, to think about how would, if you were to do an analysis plan using housing data, studying housing characteristics from CoreLogic, how would this kind of result impact your analysis plan? And I want you to think about two different kinds of situations. One where the CoreLogic housing data are objects or dependent variables in your analysis, and second, as if they are covariates or independent variables in an analysis that's focusing primarily on other variables. So if you again break into a couple of groups, I think we'll do 8 minutes for this exercise and think about how these results would inform your analysis plan under each of these scenarios. So I'll again give you about a 5-minute and about a 2-minute warning.
Zach, could I ask a clarifying question on your match rate? So that is, the denominator is the ACS households, and you're asking how many of the ACS households are found in the CoreLogic data, or?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So this reflects partly challenging linkage and partly data that are missing from CoreLogic. Yeah. All right. So go ahead and break into your groups. 5 more minutes for each team. Thanks. Last couple minutes for each team. Feel free to take your time with that, but in case the teams wrap up earlier or think they have ready with their thoughts to share, you can indicate that in the chat box to me. Thanks. So I think we should go ahead and regroup. I'll stop sharing the slides for a second. So we'll go in reverse order for this one. So if I could have a volunteer from group number 1 to share their thoughts on informing their analysis plan based upon the 2 different scenarios.
Okay, I guess I was nominated to be the speaker again, so I'll try to answer this question. So our group in our discussion is primarily around the consequences of the missing data values if it were considered as a dependable variable versus a covariate. So I think we all came to the agreement that it would be more severe, the issue would be more major if it were considered as a dependable variable because this is such large data sets. So if it were included as a covariate, we can possibly use other variables, and then also we can impute the data. It might be able to enhance the estimates a little bit in that way.
I think that's great. And then team number 2, a representative, talk about thoughts to add to that for the analysis in the 2 situations.
Hi, this is Danielle.
Hi.
So a couple of things that we talked about were issues with validity around the rural areas and also issues around some of the states not being represented in the data. And then we had a couple of questions about like, is there a threshold for what you would consider a good match? Is like 70% a good match and below that is not, or is there any kind of threshold like that? And then our other question was just trying to think about how you could deal with some of that missing data.
Yep, I think those are right on point and a very good question. So when you lost my thought for a second. When you are analyzing data and figuring out a threshold that's appropriate, it's hard to see if there's a hard and fast rule. But one thing I would strongly suggest, and I'll discuss a bit more in the next slide, is you can do sensitivity analyses. You can kind of see, based upon the extent of missing data, if you, let's say you have, you allow for a range of possibilities that are different extremes, you can kind of see if the result is robust in those different situations. Certainly, if you are using the data as a dependent variable, that's going to be really challenging. So I'll pull the slides back up. So what I would suggest if you're using the data as a dependent variable is you would focus on where the data set has a strength. So you may need to, if you had the initial hope to study the entire country for that dependent variable, you may need to limit the scope and say, well, we can't say anything about Vermont where there's no data and no statistical method is really going to allow us to make a conclusion about Vermont, but there's other data sets, there's other states where we can do a good analysis, and even though we have not hit a 90% threshold, we can use statistical methods to compensate for the non-linkage there. And then if you're just using the data as an independent variable, you don't have as strong of requirements of your data source. So there, I would definitely advocate using statistical methods to adjust. So if you have missing data, commonly people are using combined linked administrative data and survey data, and then using imputation to fill in where the administrative data are missing. You might also think about if you can have an option to use either administrative data or survey data in different geographic areas, you might rely on one or the other more in different geographic areas to draw your conclusion. But really focus, but play to the strengths of your data and focus on where the data quality is the strongest and recognize the caveats that you have for your analysis. Other points that I want to make about this slide. Yeah, so I think your range of options is really to kind of limit your analysis to where the data quality is strongest. Recognize you have two different data sources and you have different strengths in terms of what they measure, that the administrative data source may be really strong where you have the data available, but you can't use that in other areas. And then using statistical adjustment, imputation, weighting to compensate for the weaknesses. Recognizing, though, that those statistical methods rely on assumptions, sometimes strong assumptions, that where there are, if we take the example of missing data, that with the where you have missing data, where the missing data are the relationship with the variables you're interested in is the same for the missing data as the data you observed. And so that's why I think sensitivity analyses can be really important. Continue with the missing data example, you could assume that where you have missing data, the values of one extreme would be fairly low or fairly high. Taking the example of a continuous variable, you kind of check the robustness of your policy conclusion, your statistical inference to those more extreme scenarios, and your policy conclusion holds up, then you can make a really strong argument for your research. Or it's not, your result isn't robust to all different situations, and then you have a caveat to your conclusions for future research that needs to be conducted. The last point in discussing assessing quality of administrative data is before you do your research, you want to have the best sense of the data quality you can to get at the feasibility of the analysis and whether the data quality is going to be strong enough. So what are the things you can do before conducting the research to evaluate the feasibility of your project and the strengths and weaknesses of the administrative data source? So very often, other research has been done with the data. So I recommend doing a detailed literature scan, and that can be a great resource for understanding the quality to expect. What kinds of analyses were people able to do in that research? What were the limitations? What did they note about the data quality? All of that is extremely valuable. You can contact the data provider, ask for if they have a code book available or what documentation is available. In different situations, you could get different levels of helpfulness from the data provider, but that's strongly recommended. It's always good to have some level of flexibility with your research plan and be prepared for some surprises. It's hard to anticipate what it'll be like to work with a data set until you have it, at least in my experience. So that's recommended as well, but definitely use the resources you have available to do your research before proceeding with your project and putting your proposal together. So in the last part of today's talk, we're going to talk about some of the administrative aspects of a linkage with administrative data. Particularly as researchers, we have an ethical responsibility to the subjects represented in our data and the families, individuals, households, providers in the data to protect their privacy and their confidentiality. It's also important to be aware of the legal requirements for working with that data and the issues that can arise. It's possible in some situations to be subject to large fines if you violate requirements for data privacy, and not to scare you, but there are situations where jail time is a possibility. So understanding the requirements is important. So typically the laws provide guidance and restrictions for how you can access the data. So knowing this at the outset can help you assess the feasibility of your project and that it's going to work for you. So as an example with my project, analyzing the CoreLogic data and the linkage to the American Community Survey, it was about a 6-month process to obtain access to that data. I conducted at Census Research Data Center, which is a secure environment for analyzing these restricted data. The process involved being fingerprinted, giving a sworn statement to notary public, working in a room with no internet access, having output reviewed for statistical disclosure risks. I would say that's at the extreme end of what's required for data linkage projects, but is a kind of example of what might be required. So when you develop your research plan, make sure to account for this process. So data use agreements are very often required for these kinds of projects. So the data use agreement is a legal agreement, but the data producer has the responsibility to provide it, but as data users, we also have the responsibility to find out if completing one is needed to do an analysis. What it does is to transfer the responsibility for protecting the privacy and the confidentiality from the data provider to the data user when the data user is undertaking that analysis of the data. Can be different legal requirements based upon the area of application. Different laws can apply. So if you're analyzing health data, HIPAA would probably be the main one. FERPA applying to education data, the Common Rule applying to human subjects research. And I was working with Census Bureau data, Title 13 applied. There's particular rules for working with IRS data as some examples. So when do you need to get a DUA? Almost always necessary, I would say, unless the data are in the public domain. Actually had one question after this morning's lecture of somebody who was using a geographic linkage, so linking to ACS estimates at the zip code level, and that's almost certainly the kind of thing that's okay because those are published estimates that anybody can obtain and link at a geographic level. So that kind of thing would be would not have the sensitivity issues of doing person level, household level kinds of linkages. But generally the default is that you should expect to find out if one is needed if you're working with restricted data. And I would say almost certainly for every file that has personally identifiable information, PII, like social security numbers, dates of birth, things like that, protected health information, PHI, and education records at a minimum. These are all considered sensitive information under these different laws. So what goes into a DUA? It would contain the rules and restrictions on how the data products can be used, how the data can be transferred to make sure that that's done in a secure way, the rules for disclosing results and presenting the data, what's required on site for keeping the data secure. There's certainly, in some instances, possibilities of folks from a government agency administering a program doing visits to make sure that you're following all the procedures to use that data. And then it would lay out the penalties for non-compliance with the aspects of required for using that data. Okay. So as discussed with responsibility for data use agreements, so most of you I think would be the data users. So you should contact the data provider to find out what's involved with completing a DUA for your potential project. Some of you I think are might be data providers as well, or initiating that. You may be already familiar with what's required or learn about what's involved with putting together a DUA if you're sharing that data with others. Conclude with discussing informed consent. So when we conduct a survey, we engaging with that respondent who's providing that data on the web, filling out a paper questionnaire, doing a telephone interview. So that entails explicit permission for that respondent's data to be used when that's collected. For administrative data, that's not the default. The data are obtained from an agency, usually unknowingly to the individuals or entities represented in the data. So it's recommended to obtain informed consent when linking non-survey data with survey data for research use and sometimes legally required. Informed consent in general for research broadly would be voluntary agreement to participate in research. So in the linkage aspect, it would be permission to link the data to the survey data for research purposes. And motivation is, as researchers and for government agencies, we rely on trust from the public and how we use their data, and should respect survey participants, give them the self-determination how their data are used. So informed consent is important. Now, an important point is that informed consent is something that should be accounted for in analysis. I won't go into detail about all the statistical aspects of this, but informed consent rates are pretty much never 100%. They're usually related to some characteristics that are of interest to study. So if you ignore it, you could get biased results. I think later lectures are going to discuss statistical methods for adjustment in these kinds of situations. I think imputation and weighting would be the classic kinds of methods. One neat example is there's a paper on linkage of the Child Care Development Fund data to the NSECE. Rupa and Carolina were involved with looking at the consent decision and find the differences between consenting and non-consenting households. So that's an example demonstrating the differences that can occur. Yeah.
And I'm just going to interrupt to say that what we found was that in Illinois there were no systematic differences between consenting and non-consenting households. So that's a big flag that anyone can.
Okay, so today we've covered aspects of understanding administrative data. So in the next section, we'll start talking about more about data linkage, what are the different analytic purposes for which you would conduct data linkage, and then assessing project feasibility as well. So in terms of your project assignment, some questions that you would consider for an assignment based upon today's discussion. In terms of administrative data, what are the quality considerations that are important for understanding your administrative data source? How will you evaluate that data quality, and what are some of the limitations in your plan for analyzing data quality? And then questions related to planning for the access requirements for conducting your linkage and analyzing the data if you are the one conducting the linkage for the project, or the permission processes and access requirements. Who would be the one to provide access to the different data files, and what legal agreements you need to complete? Will the linkage be done by you or by a different agency? And where will the analyses be conducted and how? And then how long would the process take to account for in your planning? And a reminder to discuss any questions from these lectures or particular questions related to your projects, you can go to Canvas and register for office hours. We have some coming up tomorrow afternoon, as well as on Tuesday, I believe. And some of the references I mentioned today, some of these are good resources for thinking about administrative data and learning about the topic more deeply. So I recommend referring to some of these for more on some of the topics we discussed today. Okay, so we have a bit of extra time. So any questions about today's contents or about the course in general, people can either unmute their microphones or type questions into the chat box. All right, then. So I'll stick around for a few minutes if there's any last questions. And thanks so much. We'll see you tomorrow, and Carolina will be giving the lecture.